Good afternoon. My name is Winnie Stackelberg. I'm Executive Vice President of External Affairs at the Center for American Progress, and I have the immense honor of welcoming all of you here today. As we all know, Robert Mueller will appear tomorrow before members of Congress to detail how the Russian government worked to sabotage the 2016 elections and how Donald Trump and his allies sought to aid, abet, and cover up this operation at seemingly every turn. The president has lied over and over again in claiming that the Mueller report found no evidence of collusion, and tomorrow the American people will hear what the special counsel actually uncovered. This time around, those findings won't only be contained within the margins of the 448-page legal document. This time around, the public will hear the facts directly from Robert Mueller himself, facts which are utterly and unquestionably damning. The Mueller report describes at least 37 meetings and 272 contacts in total between Russia-linked operatives and the Trump campaign. Those contacts extended to the highest echelons of the Trump campaign and Trump's inner circle, including Donald Trump Jr. In fact, campaign manager Paul Manafort actually shared internal polling and political strategies with an alleged Russian agent. Any proud and patriotic American should have viewed the Kremlin's operation as an outright assault against the integrity of our democracy. Yet not a single member of the Trump campaign reported their interactions to the FBI. Instead, Trump himself publicly and enthusiastically encouraged the Russians to intensify their attacks. And since the election, the president has tried to derail any attempt to expose his extensive, pervasive, and ongoing relationship with Russia. Fortunately, the progressive community has remained relentless in uncovering the truth. Right after Trump took office, our sister organization, the Center for American Progress Action Fund, launched an initiative called the Moscow Project, which has performed critical research in tracking the full extent of the president's many contacts with Russia. The Moscow Project has also deconstructed every aspect of this tangled web for elected officials, members of the media, and the American public. It has even launched a podcast called The Asset that has climbed the ranks of the Apple Top 100 charts. CAP Action is proud of everything this team has accomplished under the leadership of Senior Fellow Max Bergman and his colleagues. And moving forward, the Moscow Project will continue to pursue its mission until justice is finally and fully realized. Tomorrow, it will become clearer than ever before that the Mueller report did not mark the end of the investigation, but only signaled the beginning of the next phase. Now it will be up to Congress to hold Donald Trump accountable for his actions. And today we will hear from one of the leaders standing at the very forefront of this effort, Congressman Adam Schiff. As one of our country's most prominent voices on foreign affairs, Congressman Schiff has worked to safeguard the interests of America and our allies, to advance human rights across the globe, and to expand opportunities for our nation's veterans. He is also a former federal prosecutor who serves as chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, one of the two committees that will host the special counsel during tomorrow's hearings. We're so grateful that Congressman Schiff could make time to join us this afternoon, just a few hours before what promises to be a truly pivotal moment in American history. And now I have the pleasure of turning things over to Max Bergman, director of the Moscow Project, who will moderate our conversation with Congressman Schiff. Please help me in welcoming both of them to the stage.
Well, thank you, Winnie, and thank you all for coming, and especially you, Congressman on what I know is a fairly busy day for you, I imagine, considering what is going to take place tomorrow. I wanted to start my questioning by actually quoting you and asking a question that you asked yourself on March 20th, 2017. That was the day that it was the first House Intelligence Committee hearing, and it was the day known for James Comey announcing that there was indeed an FBI investigation into the Trump campaign's ties to Russia. And you gave a very prescient opening statement in which you outlined sort of what we knew at the time on March 20th. And then you asked, is it possible that all of these events and reports are completely unrelated and that nothing more than an entirely unhappy coincidence? And you said, yes, it is possible, but it is also possible, maybe more than possible, that they are not coincidental and not disconnected, and that the Russians used the same techniques to corrupt US persons that they employed in Europe and elsewhere. We simply do not know, not yet, and we owe it to the country to find out. So 2.5 years later, what did you find out? Was this all just a random coincidence?
No, it clearly wasn't. And if I knew then that we would find evidence in writing of the Russians offering dirt on Hillary Clinton as part of what was described as the Russian government effort to help Mr. Trump, and that the Trump campaign at the highest levels, including the president's own son, would say that they would love to get that help and even suggest the best timing would be late summer, and then set up a secret meeting to receive that. If you had told me that this would be in writing, I would have thought you're crazy. Nobody is stupid enough to put that in writing. But in fact, of course, that's exactly what we would later learn. If I knew then that the campaign chairman of the Trump campaign was giving internal polling data and discussing political strategy in Midwestern states, at the same time the Russians were engaged in a social media campaign, a targeted social media campaign to influence the election, then I wouldn't have posed those questions because many of those questions would be answered. But obviously we know a lot more now, and it isn't the least bit coincidental. I do think that one of the challenges in communicating the seriousness of what the Trump campaign did by welcoming this foreign assistance, by using it, by lying about it, by obstructing the investigation into it, is that the American people have learned about this in drips and drabs. If we didn't know about that secret meeting in Trump Tower until the Mueller report came out, you could imagine the explosion. But instead, these pieces have come out discreetly. And so when the report came out, well, we already knew about that. And how does that fact relate to these other facts? But yes, I look back at that opening statement, and it seems very innocent compared to what we would later learn.
And so I want to talk a bit about the Russian interference effort, because this is where there is sort of no debate, at least from a bipartisan standpoint, that Russia did interfere in this election, in the 2016 election. And effectively, the way we've described it, had a distinct Russian campaign, a political campaign, to try to elect Donald Trump by hacking through Russian military intelligence and by setting up a digital operation with about 80 people that was roughly the same size, actually, as the Clinton digital campaign operation. What impact did foreign interference have in 2016, and is this a real problem going forward into 2020?
Well, I guess first I would take some issue with the premise, because not everyone accepts that. And indeed, the President of the United States doesn't seem to accept that. When he met with the orchestrator of this scheme, Vladimir Putin, Putin's denied it, of course, and the President said, well, he denied it strongly, and why would I believe the intelligence agencies over Vladimir Putin? And indeed, in his last conversation with Putin, he again called this a hoax. Now, when the President calls this a hoax, the Russia hoax, he quite deliberately doesn't say, is the conspiracy a hoax, or is collusion a hoax, or is the whole idea that Russia intervened a hoax. He wants it to cover everything. He's still, I think, wedded to the idea we don't really know. It could have been the Chinese or some fat guy sitting on his bed. So I'm not sure that there is universal agreement when the President of the United States doesn't seem to be able to acknowledge this. In terms of the actual impact of it, as the report makes clear, that social media campaign reached hundreds of millions of Americans. It resulted in people, ordinary Americans, unknowing that they were being communicated with by not their neighbors in Texas or their neighbors in Florida, but their neighbors in St. Petersburg, and urged to dress up like Hillary Clinton and go into a cage at a rally or organize a protest. It may have suppressed turnout. And in terms of the ultimate impact, did it decide the election? We'll simply never know. I mean, there are a lot of aspects of this that were highly influential at the very end of a close election, and certainly the cumulative total of that social media campaign, the degree to which the Russians were able to force the Clinton campaign to continually respond to their hacking and dumping of documents. But the best evidence that it was a meaningful impact on the campaign comes from Donald Trump himself. From the dozens and dozens and dozens of times in which Donald Trump trumpeted the WikiLeaks disclosures, something that he would not have done if he didn't believe that it was pivotal to his campaign.
Yeah, one point that I think is sort of lost is that the Russian interference wouldn't have been as effective, or wouldn't have worked at all almost, if Donald Trump had disavowed it, had condemned it, had said, no, we do not want you to interfere in this election, and scolded reporters for using that sort of material. And in fact, something similar actually happened in 2000 when Al Gore received a debate briefing book or video from the George W. Bush campaign and contacted the FBI. That effort to interfere in the election by stealing materials and injecting it into the political process didn't work. And is that how you read it, that Donald Trump effectively sort of aided the Russian attack by promoting WikiLeaks, by promoting the materials that Russians stole?
Well, I think without a doubt. I'm often struck in my job with sometimes the wonderful and sometimes the awful fortuity of things. The awful fortuity of 2016 was that at a time when the Russians decided to maximally involve themselves in our election, John McCain was not the nominee for the GOP, it was Donald Trump. Had it been John McCain, I'm confident that he had the strength of character to say, Russia, butt the hell out. Butt the hell out. I don't want your help, I don't need your help, I despise your intervention. But it wasn't, it was Donald Trump. And he welcomed it, and he built it into his campaign strategy. He publicly called on the Russians to hack his opponent's emails, and one of the most startling facts in the report is that within hours of him saying, hey, Russia, if you're listening, the Russians proved they were listening, because within hours was the first time they tried to hack a server belonging to the person of Hillary Clinton. And so, yes, I think certainly a lot of responsibility goes to Donald Trump. Now, I will also say this, when this was happening in real time, many of us were urging the press to be more responsible in their reporting. And by that, it is not always the case that documents that are stolen, documents that are being published as a part of foreign interference, it's not always the case that the press shouldn't report the contents of those. Sometimes the contents may be of such overriding public significance that you can't fail to report it. But the context should always be given, and often these articles, endless articles about the drip and drab of the Clinton emails, fail to begin with the most important fact, which is we only know this because the Russians want us to know. In documents believed stolen by the Russians to influence our election, this is what we learned. Without that critical context, I think the press amplified what the Russians were doing, even as Donald Trump was amplifying it.
And one of my frustrations in actually reading Volume 1 of the Mueller report compared to Volume 2 is that in Volume 2, Mueller really puts into context what people knew at the time and when they knew it. But in volume 1, he sort of dissembles the contacts, all the meetings and contacts that took place. In the course of your investigation, did you find that Trump campaign officials knew that Russia was interfering, that they were aware that WikiLeaks was, potentially acting as a Russian cutout, and at least read some of the press reporting from the Washington Post in June 14th, 2016? Was there awareness on the part of the Trump campaign of what was happening at the time?
Of course there was awareness of the Trump campaign, and they were reading the clippings like all the rest of us. They didn't need an intel briefing, although they did get a briefing that the Russians were interfering in August. But even without the briefing, it was patently obvious what was going on, and but they were delighted to have the help. The ethic was, and we don't have to wonder about this because we hear it from the president today. Hey, if a foreign government is going to offer you dirt on your opponent, why not? And even after all we've been through, when that question is posed to the president or Rudy Giuliani or Jared Kushner, none of them can bring themselves to say that they would refuse it or they would alert the authorities. Their ethic is you'd be a sap not to take the help. And the only line that matters is not patriotism, it's not ethics, it's not morality, it's just whether you can escape criminal prosecution. You could do everything up to the bar of escaping criminal prosecution. And the problem, of course, with that standard for a president of the United States is when you have an attorney general who believes that the president of the United States can make any criminal case go away, even ones implicating the president, if he thinks they're unfair, then it's a license for lawlessness by the president.
So you don't buy Jared Kushner's sort of obliviousness, his claim that in June he was just oblivious in meeting with those Russian representatives in Trump Tower, and then again obliviously met with Russians in November and December.
They were notified in advance by Don Jr. about what that meeting was about. The reason why Jared Kushner wanted to be rescued from the meeting, the reason why they thought it was a waste of time is they came to get dirt from the Russians on their opponent. And yes, they got dirt, but it wasn't really that usable. It wasn't the dirt they really wanted because, of course, they knew the Russians had stolen emails. They had much more valuable dirt. And even as early as April 2016, Papadopoulos is advised that the Russians can help with the anonymous release of these stolen emails. And of course, that's the modus operandi the Russians would end up using. It was better for the Russians to release them through WikiLeaks than give them directly to the campaign and get caught. The WikiLeaks publication gave them some deniability, even if it wasn't very good deniability. But the idea that this meeting, which they held in secret, this meeting that they all denied having, because of course they said we never had any meetings with any Russians. Don Jr. was indignant with the idea anyone would suggest he ever met with any Russians during the campaign. And then of course when it gets revealed, then they come up with this phony statement that the president dictates that the meeting was about adoptions. And so the idea that there's some innocent rubes falls completely flat. And I thought one of the weaker sections of the report, frankly, was the analysis of the knowledge of the participants in that meeting, where the report does point out that they couldn't show with admissible evidence what the state of Don Jr.'s knowledge was in terms of the criminality of his actions, because he was new to a presidential campaign, or that's the implication. There's no discussion about that vis-a-vis Paul Manafort. This wasn't the first presidential campaign that Paul Manafort was involved in. So, and the concealment of both the meeting and the concealment of the truth later, most prosecutors would consider pretty powerful evidence of wrongfulness, of knowledge of wrongfulness of conduct.
So one question on that. On our podcast, The Asset, we actually interviewed a Senate Judiciary staffer who had left, who had actually deposed Donald Trump Jr., unlike Robert Mueller. Why do you know why Robert Mueller decided that he didn't need to actually ask Donald Trump Jr. questions about that meeting and what took place?
Well, I'm sure that the Mueller team understood the importance of interviewing Don Jr., just as they understood the importance of interviewing the president. And so that's about all I'm going to say on that today.
Well, I want to shift gears for a second. In 1990, you actually successfully prosecuted the first FBI agent convicted of espionage. It was this famed case, Richard Mueller, who was passing classified information on to Soviet officials, onto the KGB. Do you see any similarities, lessons learned from that case that you see sort of coming back, all these years later, and how the Russians operate?
I do, and this is certainly for me my life coming full circle. 30 some odd years ago, prosecuting an FBI agent for spying effectively for the Russians. And I'll tell you one thing that came out of that. I must have worked with dozens and dozens of FBI agents, and even though it was an investigation into one of their own, I developed a lifelong respect for the professionalism of the FBI. They really are just a cut above. But what I learned in prosecuting that case was a lot about Russian tradecraft. How do the Russians use their assets in this country? Svetlana Ogorodnikova, who was the seductress. For some reason, they're always named Svetlana. So be careful out there with Svetlanas. She was a Russian asset, a Soviet asset. She emigrated to the United States, which is an act the Soviets considered of treachery, of traitorous character, was unhappy in the United States, wanted to go back, and had to earn her passage back. So I learned about how the Soviets used their assets in other countries. I learned how they targeted people that had access to classified information, how they could identify people with financial troubles or people with infidelity in their marriage, and Richard Mueller was a good target for them. And the inducements were sex and were financial. Those are sort of age-old inducements. And if you look at the investigation here, who were the weak links in the Trump organization that the Russians might identify? Well, Carter Page kind of screams out at you. George Papadopoulos, you can look at other potential targets like Paul Manafort. Paul Manafort had a pre-existing relation with people affiliated with Russian intelligence. Paul Manafort was driven by a desire to make money. Paul Manafort wanted to be made whole for work he'd already done, wanted to be able to monetize his work on the campaign after the campaign. All of those factors make them ripe for potential targeting. And what the Russians do with their tradecraft is they'll ask you for something relatively innocuous, and you'll give them that, and then they'll ask you for something a little less innocuous, or maybe they'll give you a certain gratuity, and then before you know it, you're hooked because they can expose anything you've done thus far. And so certainly a lot of the facts look very much like Russian tradecraft. Begin by, and I don't even know if they had to ask Manafort for briefings, internal briefings about the campaign. And then, well, how about polling data? And how about strategy in these key states? And so here they had someone who may have been willing to offer this without even being asked. We don't really know the precise nature of their communication, among other things because some of the players were using encrypted apps and other communications were destroyed. And of course, other players like Kilmenick are not the least bit cooperative.
And when I entered the State Department, the process of getting a top secret security clearance, of going through the SF-86 background investigation, was incredibly extensive. And one of the major things that investigators are looking at is to determine whether there's issues in my background, finances, foreign context that could make me compromised. As part of the investigation, the FBI announced that it was opening a counterintelligence, or didn't announce it, it opened a counterintelligence investigation after James Comey was fired. Do you think, what's the status of that investigation, and do you think that the president is compromised?
Well, the status of the counterintelligence investigation is one of the big unanswered questions publicly. And privately, we have been getting information about that, and just to back up a bit, this all began not as a criminal investigation, but as a counterintelligence investigation to determine whether people were acting as witting or unwitting agents of a foreign power, whether the Russians were engaged in an active measures campaign influencing U.S. Opinion leaders, policymakers, campaign people. The Mueller report, though, is a criminal report. We decided to prosecute these people. We did not decide to prosecute these people. Here's why. It doesn't say anything about their counterintelligence findings. That is, who is a risk, and how does that risk mitigate it? The result of a counterintelligence investigation is not necessarily prosecution, although sometimes it becomes that. There are other ways to mitigate the risk. If you look at Mike Flynn, for example, as Sally Yates testified, the concern with Flynn when he lied to people in the administration, like the vice president, and then the vice president misled the country about whether he was discussing sanctions with the Russian ambassador. The risk, as Sally Yates explained, is that the Russians knew what they had been talking about. And so the Russians knew the administration was misrepresenting this, and the Russians presumably could expose it if they chose, and that means they had compromise on Mike Flynn. We also know that the president was seeking to make a big real estate deal in Moscow, and he was denying it to the country. He had no business dealings with Russia, is what he was telling people. And his associates, like Michael Cohen, were coming before Congress and lying about it. And the Russians knew those were lies because the Russians were on the other end of that transaction. When Michael Cohen had a lengthy conversation with someone who worked for Dmitry Peskov, someone very close to Putin, the Russians knew in great detail about this, and of course the Trump people knew the Russians knew, and that gave the Russians leverage over Donald Trump and over Michael Cohen and over anyone in the administration. And what is so compromising about this is that when it was revealed a year after the fact that the negotiations on the building went on long after people had said, went on to the middle of the campaign, and that the campaign had emailed the Kremlin and called the Kremlin, Dmitry Peskov issued a statement saying, we never responded to that. Okay, that was a lie. So here you have the Kremlin covering up for the President of the United States, who's covering up for his own business. And hard to imagine something more compromising except this. When this was found out and the President was confronted about it, his answer was, well, I might have lost the election. And it's not a crime. There again is the standard for the administration. We can do anything that can't be proven beyond a reasonable doubt to be a crime. And then he said, why should I miss out on those opportunities? We still don't know whether the president intends to build Moscow Trump Tower when he leaves office. It may very well be his opinion to this day that I may lose my reelection. Why should I miss out on those opportunities? It's hard to imagine something more compromising than a project worth hundreds of millions of dollars. So that ought to concern every American, to paraphrase Bob Mueller, reporting on other aspects of the Russian activity.
You know, when Mueller outlined the Russian interference campaign, he sort of identified two lines of effort. There was a hacking campaign, there was a social media campaign. But one of the things that we've started to see in Europe is that there's usually a financial component to Russian interference. There's been financial ties from a Russian bank to Marine Le Pen, the National Front in France, recent stories in Italy connected with far-right parties of dangling of Russian money. It seems to me rather odd that there wouldn't be a Russian financial component to interfering in U.S. elections. It is, after all, what candidates need. It's what campaigns, politicians are constantly asking for donations, asking people for money. The easiest way to support a campaign is, in fact, to fund it. Did Mueller look into the finances? Do you have a sense of whether money was, have Mueller examined whether Russian money laundering somehow made its way into the Trump campaign?
The short answer is we don't know. We don't know what the scope of Mueller's investigation was. We don't know whether the decisions on scope were imposed on him by the acting Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General. We don't know the answer to that. And this is one of the reasons why we place such a high priority on following the money. Because if that wasn't done, at least it wasn't done as part of the criminal probe, then someone needs to look at whether there was financial compromise. And the report makes clear that Mueller considered his mandate to be very narrow. As you point out, he considered his mandate to be investigating the social media operation, investigating the hacking and dumping operation, and determining very narrowly whether he could prove the elements of conspiracy of the Trump campaign with either of those two lines of effort. In terms of whether there was an investigation into whether there were other means of influence, we don't know. We don't know, and we are determined to find out. And we are also determined to make sure that we do what is ever necessary to expose any compromise so that we can protect ourselves.
Are you happy with the cooperation from financial institutions like Deutsche Bank? Have you been able to get financial records that you've been after?
The financial institutions, I think, are more than willing to cooperate. Of course, they're being sued by Trump to prevent them from cooperating. So this is why we're in litigation. And so far, we're winning the litigation. The lower courts that have addressed this not only ruled in our favor, but also gave such short shrift to the Trump arguments. And the opinions of the courts that looked at our Deutsche Bank case, that looked at the Oversight Committee's Mazer accounting case, and we're doing ours jointly with the Financial Services Committee, was sort of the legal equivalent of get out of my court, is what they told the Trump organization. Your arguments have merit, and they don't even have color of merit. And so we feel pretty optimistic. The goal, I think, of the Trump administration and organization, even advancing what I think they know are spurious arguments, is just to draw this out as long as we possibly can.
Do you have concern how investigation concluded? Robert Mueller throughout Volume 2 notes that firing of Jeff Sessions was something on his mind because he needed control over the investigation. And then Trump, lo and behold, fired Jeff Sessions and appointed Matthew Whitaker of no qualifications, then appointed Bill Barr. Yet that's not Mueller when he actually fired Jeff Sessions. And maybe nothing happened. Do you have any concerns for how the investigation concluded?
Well, I have continuing concerns about the ongoing investigations in particular. And yes, I have concern about the ending of the Mueller investigation. We have very little, if any, visibility into, for example, why the special counsel decided not to pursue an interview with the president. Why not subpoena the president? Now, the president played rope-a-dope with the special counsel for a long time. And I can certainly understand, from a personal point of view, why the prospect of entering into lengthy litigation to finally get that interview before you can conclude your investigation wasn't very attractive to people who had devoted their whole lives living in a bunker working on this investigation. But nonetheless, there was no way to get a better answer to those questions, and the questions that were of the greatest importance in terms of the president's state of mind were the ones that he precisely refused to answer, even in writing, those that went to obstruction of justice. So I am concerned about whether, in addition to their own personal desire to have the investigation over with, whether there was pressure on them from justice to bring this to an end. But more than that, when Barr testified that he believed if the president thought it was unfair, he could have made it go away anytime he wanted, the implication of that is that he could also make any of these other investigations referred by Bob Mueller, including the one that was just apparently closed in the Southern District of New York, go away. And we are determined to ride shotgun to the best that we're able, to find out if there is any improper political influence over any of these other cases. And at the end of the day, to find out whether there was any improper role of Bill Barr or Matt Whitaker or anything else in any of the key points in the main investigation.
So at this time tomorrow, you will be presiding over a hearing with Robert Mueller. What are your expectations? It feels like the Super Bowl where everyone's sort of plotting out how it will go. How do you think tomorrow will unfold?
I would imagine by this time, Bob Mueller will have cracked. He will have acknowledged that but for the DOJ policy would have indicted the president. And he will say, in fact, because Bill Barr told me I could have reached that conclusion, I am now ready to reach that conclusion. I'm joking. Well, I hope that where we are at this time tomorrow is with a better public understanding of the gravity of what the Russians did, the systemic nature of what the Russians did, and the gravity of what the Trump campaign did and what our own president did, how unethical it was, how unpatriotic it was. Whether it could be proved to meet all the elements of the crime of conspiracy to willingly invite, make use of foreign help, and not just foreign help, but help from a foreign adversary, a country that wishes us ill. And then to obstruct an investigation into that foreign interference for reasons of selfish protection of reputation or a desire to avoid criminal culpability, regardless of what it does to the country and how it leaves the country vulnerable. If the country has a better understanding of those facts, I'll consider the hearing to be successful. And I know that most people don't have the opportunity to read all 448 pages, and even those who do, I'm a prosecutor. This is my language. They are speaking in this report. I understand it. I recognize what it means. If Mueller concluded that there was not sufficient evidence to prove each element of the crime of conspiracy, and he was willing to say so, because he couldn't prove sufficiently willful intent on Don Jr., or he couldn't prove the value of the dirt they got met the statutory threshold. If he could say that there was not sufficient evidence of this, but he couldn't say that about obstruction, the negative inference is clear. There was sufficient evidence to prove the crime of obstruction. That's clear to me as a prosecutor. It's why more than 1,000 other prosecutors have said, if this were their case, if he wasn't the president, any other person would be indicted. But I think because of the incessant campaign by the president, and I give him credit for being ruthlessly on message, he, I think, has endeavored to prevent the American people from understanding the seriousness, the appalling lack of integrity that he demonstrated during his campaign and demonstrates to this day.
I want to ask you one last question on Mueller and on, you've been asked a lot about impeachment. But I think one of the major kind of concerns among Democrats, progressives, people who voted in November to hold Trump accountable, to make sure no one's above the law, is that it kind of feels like he's been able to get away with so much and continuing to obstruct your ability to conduct investigations. Is tomorrow sort of, a big event and then we sort of all move on with our lives, or is that going to be the sort of the start of sort of a more rigorous process or public process?
I don't know what the impact of the hearing will be. I think, very realistic in my expectations. People are pretty dug in on not just Trump and Russia, but they're just dug in on this president. If that appalling display of racism over the last 2 weeks wasn't enough to move people, is there anything that Bob Mueller can say that will? And so I'm very circumspect about what the impact will be, but at the same time, I imagine that there'll be millions of people watching this hearing that have never had the chance to read the report. And there is a natural tendency among Americans to think, God, if it wasn't true, he couldn't keep saying it, right? Well, sadly, wrong. There are a great many things the president says over and over and over again, and they're just as untruthful the first time he said it as the 1,000th time he said it. And so for many Americans, just learning what's in the report will be a revelation. And what the impact of that will be on the Congress, what the impact will be on the country, I don't know. But I tend to be very realistic about how much this very polarized country is moved by anything these days.
One of the things that I think the public doesn't necessarily realize is that this is just one slice of your broader job. And I wanted to ask you about the current situation in Iran, the seizure of a British oil tanker. How do you see events unfolding? Are you concerned about the Trump administration's efforts to essentially, the Iranians are no angels, but effectively to look like they're provoking a conflict, to instigate a conflict?
I think we are closer to a potential conflict with Iran than any time since I've been in Congress, and that's been almost 20 years now. And it's not because I think Iran wants to go to war, and it's not because I think Donald Trump wants to go to war. It's because the risk of miscalculation has never been greater. The tragedy about where we are right now is this was so eminently predictable. And in fact, I think that we could tell this from our own intelligence, that if we went down this road, if we left the JCPOA when the Iranians were complying, if we reimposed sanctions and tried to get others to reimpose their sanctions, that Iran wasn't going to stay indefinitely within the nuclear deal. If you deprive Iran of any benefit from it, why are they going to stay in the deal? And so it was eminently foreseeable that what they would do would be to try to drive a wedge between the United States and our allies, to up the temperature, to up the risk, and to use that to get Europe to try to help them financially, get out from under the sanctions. And this is exactly what's happening. The reluctance of our allies to attribute these attacks to Iran, and of course it's becoming harder and harder for them to do so, given that Iran just seized a British tanker. But the reluctance to even attribute this conduct to Iran isn't because of questions in the intelligence. I mean, you seldom have video of Iran retrieving an unexploded mine. But rather, I think, reflects the view of our allies that this is exactly what we told you would happen. This is exactly why we didn't want you to leave the JCPOA, and now you want us to link arms with you and march to war with Iran? Well, we just don't want to go there. So where we are is tragically predictable. And now where do we go from here? I think we are going to need to protect shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. I think we need to try to coax our allies into working with us to protect that shipping. Our efforts should not be unilateral. We should be doing it in concert with our allies. And we need to recognize that the goal here ought to be isolation of Iran, not isolation of the United States. I'm reminded of a comment that Tom Friedman made during the middle of the Iraq War when we invited him to speak to our caucus. And he was asked, what would you do about Iraq? And he said, well, to quote the New York cop who's asked by a tourist directions how to get somewhere, the cop says, well, I wouldn't start from here. And I certainly wouldn't choose to start from here, but I think that's what we need to do.
And lastly, I wanted to ask you about, it was reported recently that Devin Nunes met with, Devin Nunes, now the ranking member on the Intelligence Committee, met with Donald Trump discussing a replacement for the Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coats. Do you have concerns about that next appointment, about Dan Coates' future, and about Devin Nunes' sort of conversation and him potentially being a possible candidate for that role?
Well, let me just say that what you should want in a director of national intelligence is someone who understands what the agencies do, someone who's a good manager of people, and someone who has the strength to speak truth to power, whether that is speaking truth to Congress or speaking truth to the president. I think Dan Coats has done all of that, and I hope he will continue. I think he's been a terrific intelligence head, and I hope that he stays. So that's my feeling on Dan Coats, and I'm not going to comment on the rest of your question, much as I am tempted.
With that, we have time for just a couple questions. Yes.
Amy McKinnon from Foreign Policy Magazine. Thank you so much for coming out today. I'm sure you're incredibly busy ahead of tomorrow. My question is that, one of the things everybody talks about when they talk about the Russian operation is that it was to sow division and chaos, and I don't think it's controversial to say that that worked to a certain degree. I'm just curious how you plan on continuing investigations, but without further deepening those divides that have already been established.
Great question, and one of the issues that we have been exploring in the committee is how the Russians might intervene again, but use new technology to be even more effective. And one of the areas that I'm most concerned about is the development of deep fake technology. This is a technology that allows the production of compelling video and audio that is utterly fraudulent. So you can produce a deep fake of Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or Donald Trump or anyone else, insert it into the social media ecosystem, and it would be indistinguishable from real for most people viewing it with the naked eye. A lot of the fakes that people have seen thus far have been crude. The fake of Nancy Pelosi is what's called a cheap fake, the one where when she was speaking, I think here, at one of the CAP conferences, was slowed down to make her seem impaired. And you might imagine, had the Russians had that technology 4 years earlier during the last presidential election, where they were trying to push out a narrative that the Trump campaign was also trying to push out, that Hillary Clinton was in failing health, that they could easily push out videos to make Hillary Clinton look like she was impaired. So that is of a deep concern. So we are looking at not just the last war, but what is the next war going to look like? What is the next disinformation campaign going to look like? And how do we prepare against the late distribution of a fraudulent video? So we are also doing our best to scrutinize what are the states doing in terms of the voting technology. How is the federal government helping the states prepare? We are doing the work that we would hope that the president would do, but is not. And that is, in our various committees, the Foreign Affairs Committee is pressing the State Department. What are they doing to communicate to the Russians the sanctions they will see if they screw with us again? We in the Intel Committee are focused with our intel agencies. What are you hearing? What are you learning about Russian plans and intentions, or anyone else's plans and intentions? And in Homeland Security, they're focused on what is the department doing, what states are vulnerable, what states still don't have paper ballots or a paper trail. That ought to be led from the top, but it isn't, because for any of the cabinet people to raise this with the president, he considers a threat to his legitimacy, and the president himself is certainly not going to raise it. So we are trying in Congress to use our leverage and oversight powers to do that.
Yes, and okay.
much. Olivia Gazis with CBS News. Mr. Chairman, the House Judiciary Committee has confirmed that Mr. Mueller tomorrow will be joined by Aaron Zebley, his close aide, in the capacity of his counsel. Is the same thing going to happen before the House Intelligence Committee, and how does that change the dynamic of the conversation tomorrow?
I think it is certainly the desire of the special counsel to have one of his team present with him during the hearing. We are in discussions with them about that and what that would look like. But our intention is that Mueller do the testifying and not have someone else do it for him. Now, there may be questions that one of his team is better situated to answer of a technical nature, but we don't want a hearing with Bob Mueller converted to a hearing with someone else. So we're discussing what the format would be and just what the role would be of having one of his team present. And this has been a continuing discussion with the special counsel's office. And I would expect that he will have someone with him, and we are in discussions about precisely in what capacity that person will appear with him.
Yes.
Richard Coleman, CBP, retired. I'm struck at the power of a memo from the Justice Department to thwart what appear to be constitutional rights of the Congress to pursue what you are rightly pursuing. Just like executive privilege seems to mean whatever they want it to mean. Can you address the legality and the power, and why is this a wall that can't be overcome?
The administration is making the broadest, most unsustainable claims of executive privilege, I think, that any president has ever made. It is a stonewalling and delay tactic, but it is one that ultimately we have to litigate. And they know that, and so for them it's a way to stall. They understand when it gets to litigation, it gets to judgment, they lose, except on the narrowest category of documents where there should be a privilege. But this blanket assertion of privilege, this really prophylactic assertion of a privilege to later assert a privilege, is legally unsupportable. And yes, they are going to delay resolution of this. That's their whole point. And what they're doing with the Congress is just what they did with special counsel, which is delay, 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 and then blame the Democrats for the delay. So that's their stratagem. We've had discussion about constitutional crises and whatnot. We will be in a true full-fledged constitutional crisis if we ever get to the point where we have a final adjudication from the court and they still refuse. If this president takes the view that, someone could correct me, I think it was President Jackson once took when the Supreme Court issued a ruling he didn't like, he said, okay, that's your opinion, now let's see you enforce it. If we get to that point, then we are in a full-blown crisis. But I think at this point they're just using this to stall. And I would like to see us revive our inherent contempt power, where we can try people within the House and we can levy daily fines until they comply. So I'm urging that we do so. It seems to me that if there was ever an administration deserving of the Congress's use of inherent contempt, it's this one. The last thing I'll say is we are already writing our own post-Watergate reforms. I don't expect most of them to pass because the GOP in Congress has turned into a cult of the president. They are not acting like a responsible political party. When he is gone, when Trump is gone, when they no longer need to fear an angry tweet from Donald Trump, then maybe they will find their sense of obligation, and we will be able to pass these reforms, I think, on a bipartisan basis. But they're unwilling to stand up to him. And so some of the corrective action will have to wait until this president is out of office.
If I could use the power of the moderator to just follow up on that question. Russian interference, the hacking of voting systems in 2016 was a tremendous concern. Senate Intelligence Committee did a lot of investigation on this point. Do you have concerns about the security of the election, the actual voting systems going into 2020? And what do you think the chances are of legislation actually becoming law, getting through the Senate?
I do have great concerns about the voting technology, both because the vendors of this technology are unwilling to share their software so we can examine vulnerabilities. People that I respect in the Silicon Valley, who are far more expert in these matters than I am, are convinced of the vulnerability of the technology. Because many of the states and localities have not had sufficient resources, they haven't even upgraded the software in these systems. Some are using systems that have software that can no longer be upgraded. And so I think it is negligence per se not to have a paper trail. The Russians actually don't need to change the vote count. They just need to create a doubt among our people as to whether we can rely on the vote count. So that's a pretty low bar to have a hugely disruptive impact. And imagine going through a Bush v. Gore electronic dangling Chad situation in a country as polarized as we are today. So I'm desperately concerned about this. I do think, as I felt in 2016, though, that the less risky, more effective vector for Russian interference may not be to change the votes, but to change the voters, and do so by use of things like deep fakes. And a deep fake that is designed to tap into a narrative that one side or the other has about a candidate could be enormously effective. If 20 million people saw the cheap fake of Nancy Pelosi, experts will tell you that a fraction of those 20 million will later learn that it was doctored. And even those who do learn it's doctored will never completely lose the impression they had of seeing that misinformation. So I tend to think that also because there's less risk of attribution with inserting at multiple places on the planet a deep fake, that it's a more attractive way to be disruptive for our adversaries.
Well, on that cheery note, I want to thank Chairman Schiff for coming here today, but not just for coming here today. I started the questioning by quoting you from March 20th. I think over the last 2.5, 3 years, your leadership on the threat of Russian interference, on what actually the threat to our democracy, you have shown tremendous leadership, and I want to thank you for that. And please join me in thanking Chairman Schiff.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.